gift certificates, do so. Grab a few for your friends. Who's counting? And be sure you get our newsletter and so on. One other thing I'll mention that I may not have mentioned in Learn the Bible in 24 Hours, I mentioned that it's like a semester in college. You get 3 hours credit Louisiana Baptist University towards any of their advanced degree programs, just for going through this. What I didn't mention, we're also working that out for all the commentaries. We can actually mentor you all the way through to the PhD level entirely from the publications that are on CD-ROM out there. For those that are, and one of the things I want to challenge you to do, something for you to pray about on your way home, consider leading a home Bible study. It's one of the most rewarding enterprises you can imagine. And it doesn't take that much effort to stay just a little ahead of your class, go through a book of the Bible, pick your book, or go through the 24-hour Bible program. Either way, a chapter a week kind of thing. It's not hard to bone up over the week, on the chapter and stay ahead of the group so you can lead it. But by the time you get through that book, you'll know that book. And what an exciting thing. It'll change your life. And that's to us where the real action is. I think that's where God's pouring out His Spirit. I think that He always puts new wine in new skins. So you might pray about that on the way. What we're going to do, assuming that I've got my toggle right on this, guys? You got title slide, or do I have to toggle this? Ah, okay, we're on. Good. This may sound like a strange topic, but it does have prophetic relevance to our day. We're going to talk a little bit about biotech. How many of you have heard of cloning or stem cells or biotech lately? Okay. Did you know it has a biblical relevance? I like to call it the new sorcerer's apprentice. And you may wonder, where are we going and why? Well, there appear to be long-sought remedies emerging for many of mankind's most elusive diseases, all kinds of cover articles. There are astonishing advances in molecular biology that will affect every one of us, even to the extent that most of the technical journals are predicting human cloning within 2 years. Some say within 12 months. The idea of a cloned baby is disturbing for many reasons. And there are also, as we go look at all the possibilities here, some very serious concerns to those that are the most informed. We find that they're growing human ears on mice. That bother you a little bit? I'm going to suggest also before we're through that there are biblically relevant implications, prophetic implications on our horizon. Now our agenda, part one, we're going to talk a little bit about this as a possible panacea. We'll talk about the tissues and the issues. And then we'll also talk about the possibility that what we're really doing here is opening a Pandora's box, because we're tampering with the engines of creation, and it has, we think, some possible prophetic implications. Why do I call it the Sorcerer's Apprentice? You may remember von Goethe's Der Zauberlehrling, which is the magic student, which was made into a famous piece of music by Paul Dukas in 1897. Most of us got acquainted with it perhaps in Fantasia, Walt Disney's 1940 extravaganza. And of course the whole theme of this piece of music and its heritage is a student of a sorcerer was trying to do a spell on his own and didn't get it quite correct, and he unleashed forces which proved uncontrollable. His teacher finally had to intervene to terminate the impending disaster. That's the flavor of the piece of literature. Well, that may be exactly what we've done here. As we try to build a map of physical reality, say, start looking at our human body, which of course is composed of organs, which in turns are composed of tissues, which in turns are composed of cells, which in turn are composed of molecular robots we'll talk about. And if you go below that, you have atomic structure, then subatomic particles, and the great discovery today is that the subatomic particles have no locality. We're actually in a gigantic digital simulation, it seems. But what we want to focus on a little bit, because most of us may not have had the exposure to cells, or what we may think we know about cells is rather naive. I'd like to talk a little bit, before we get into this, about the cell revealed. I call it a constellation of miracles. If you think of the human cell, imagine it as a gigantic miniature city. I'll show you why. Michael Denton in 1986 pointed out that although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, each is in effect a veritable micro-miniaturized factory. containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery made up of 100 billion atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man, and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. The simple cell, we've all seen pictures of that in our little high school textbooks, when in fact there is no such thing. The simplest cell is unparalleled in its complexity and adaptive design. It has a central memory bank. It's composed of assembly plants and processing units, repackaging and shipping centers. It's all made up of robot machines in the form of protein molecules. Each one of these have typically about 3,000 atoms in three-dimensional configurations, and there are hundreds of thousands of different types in each one. And by the way, they're connected with elaborate communication systems and quality control and repair mechanisms, and we're just beginning to try to understand the elegance of that design. If you and I were going to build a model of a simple cell, and let's assume we're going to build a model that's 1,000 million times larger than life. That means that each atom would be about the size of a tennis ball. We'd need 10 million atoms, 10 to the 13th. By the way, that's a big number. If you counted those one per minute, it would take you 19 million years just to count them. And of course, the model would be over 10 miles in diameter. These things are complicated. Now, the cell is typically surrounded by a plasma membrane, but that's oversimplified. It includes gateways with special signal receptors as to who to allow in and out. The part inside is called the cytoplasm. There's a nucleus, of course, which is the information center. There's a master library there. There are automated factories that make products. They have power plants. Mitochondrions are the power plants, the energy sources for the entire city, if you will. They have what they call the Golgi apparatus, which is processing, packaging, shipping, export preparation, and all kinds of vesicules which store and transport and deal with trash disposal. You have a whole city we call the cell. Now, inside this cell, you have automated factories, hundreds of thousands of different kind of robots. They have digital languages and decoding systems. I want to talk about that in a minute. They have memory banks for storing information. There's a master file, and you make copies from the master file for whatever you're going to do. They have elegant control systems for regulating the automated assembly of these components. It indulges in prefabrication and modular construction. It even has proofreading equipment to correct errors and ensure quality. Many years ago, I was one of the top executives at the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan, and one of our proudest assets in those days was the River Rouge plant in Dearborn. And if you ever get a chance to visit, you want to see it. It's the largest integrated manufacturing plant in the world. It has 100 miles of railroad under one roof. In one end of the plant comes raw limestone, iron ore, and coal. Inside the plant, they manufacture their own steel, their own glass, their own paint. They have an automated engine plant that builds the engines. They have out the other end of the plant come brand new cars. Not only are they assembled, the steel, the glass, the paint are manufactured under that roof. And it's known as the largest integrated manufacturing plant in the world. The cell, the simple cell, is more complicated than the River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan, and it can do something River Rouge cannot do. It can replicate its entire self within a matter of a few hours. All cells on the planet Earth derive from previous cells. You never see a new cell created on its own. What happens when a cell replicates is absolutely astonishing. The choreography of the elements is magnificent. The first phase is mitosis. Mitosis is the splitting of the nucleus, and we'll take a look at it here. I hope. There we go. Okay. Whoops. There we go. The chromosomes have condensed and duplicated themselves, and they're going to migrate to the center. The molecules form what they call the mitotic spindle, which forms. You notice the nucleus has disappeared. These chromosomes have been condensed. They're going to move to the center. We go to the second phase, the metaphase. This mitotic spindle is going to attract the kinetochore. That's the place where these condensed chromosome duplicates will connect to it. Now, how they find themselves in the right place is a mystery. How this is all choreographed is a mystery. But all the different parts know exactly where they have to go. The cell does its normal thing, then suddenly the music starts, so to speak. They all change and do something different, what you're watching here. And the chromosomes are drawn to the mitotic spindle. They're connected when all is in place. We'll go to the next phase, which is the anaphase, and we'll go right to the telophase. This is where these identical pairs are now split and pulled to each side. How they know how to do this? This, of course, all happened by accident, right? This was all designed by chance. It involves most elegant design concepts in engineering to pull this all off. They're drawn to each end, and then some interesting things start to happen. How they know what to do is interesting. The mitotic spindles dwindle and back off. New nuclei will form. Microfilaments will begin to pinch this off into two parts, and you have the completion of the cytokinesis, the splitting of the cell. Praise God. An absolute miracle. The complexity of this choreography defies one's imagination. We don't even understand. We give it fancy names, but we don't really understand what's all happening. They're trying to study how these elements can see each other and know where to go. They have no idea where this goes. But let's just talk about the chromosome themselves for a minute. Just the mechanics of it are astonishing. Imagine that you had two strands of monofilament fishing line 125 miles long. And what I want you to do is find a way to store all that inside a basketball. And to do it in such a way that you can take it out, read it, and put it back without tangling. Okay? I want you to be able to unzip it, copy it, and then restore it on spools at 3 times the speed of an airplane propeller, all without tangling. That's the analogy of what happens to this, your DNA, which in real life is about 6 feet long, and yet it's compressed microscopically. Here's an example of the condensed chromosome. If you unravel that, you get the condensed chromatin. If you unravel that, you find you've got the loop domain. You're not at the DNA yet, because as you unravel this, you discover it's made up of a whole string of little spools. Around each spool, we have which are called packed nucleosomes. Around each one of them, you finally end up, when you unravel this, you have the DNA thread, and you finally end up with the famous double helix that you've all seen pictures of. Incredible architecture, incredible engineering to get this all compressed in such a way that thousands and thousands of times per hour, it's taken apart, read, copied, and put away without tangling, without making mistakes. Astonishing. The double helix, of course, you've all seen models of this. These are all just computer models of the famous double helix. You'll notice that there are certain kinds of code. Inside that double helix is an alphabet of 4 letters. With 4 letters, those 4 letters can define any one of 20 amino acids. Let's take a quick look at some of this. It's interesting, by the way, this is all digital. It's all digitally defined. That's exactly what Genesis 1 suggests. When God made the beast of the earth after his kind, the cattle after their kind, everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. It's digital. There are no in-between categories. No wonder they can't find a missing link. There aren't any missing links. It's digitally defined. You see, thoughts are expressed in language. You need to be sensitive to the difference between the technology of content versus the technology of conveyance. I can be a book publisher and I can talk about paper, ink, and bindings. It's got nothing to do with the quality of the manuscript. There's 2 different technologies here. The technology of conveyance, be it a book or communication over a channel or television or whatever, that's one thing, quite independent of the content of the program or the manuscript. Discern the difference between technology of content, technology of conveyance. Understand the difference between the manuscript and the media. Did the ink write the book? That's what they would have us believe, if you believe the high school textbooks. And of course, the code of DNA was unraveled early in 1953 with Watson and Crick, and of course climaxed last year with their mapping of the human genome. The Human Genome Project is attempting to unravel 3.1 billion letters in a typical DNA. Thanks to competition between the private sector and the government sector, it finished ahead of time, 5 years ahead of its original schedule. It's a massive information science challenge. Notice I'm not talking about microbiology here. Information sciences, understanding the coding. It involves the most sophisticated cryptographic coding on the planet Earth, all by accident, of course. If you study language, the first element of language is semantics. Things take significance where they're positioned. Remember Paul Revere's ride? He was to watch the Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea. You see, that first lantern told you nothing because it just told you the guy didn't follow the ladder getting up there. All the information was in that second bit. One if by land, if the English were coming, one if by land, two if by sea. There's an example of a binary coded signal. If the British had had super Cray computers, they could not have broken that code. Why? It's a digital code that has its significance entirely by pre-arrangement. A digital language gets its meaning by arbitrary definitions that are applied consistently. And the great discovery of the DNA is that it's a digital code. That means it had to be designed, it could not evolve. And we have the semantics, we have the syntax, we have the Old North Church. It wasn't just a lantern, two lanterns hanging someplace, they had to be in the right place. And so this could not have been by random. Codes cannot occur by random chance. They imply coordinated planning or design. There are simple alphabets. Most are familiar with those. What you may not realize is some codes can be error detecting. They can be designed in such a way that if there's an error, the code senses it. In the computer field, we call those parity checks, for an example. You can set up parity checks so if there's enough of them, they'll tell you which, not only is there an error, it'll tell you which bit is an error, and if it's binary, you can reverse it. So you can make codes that are reversing. I remember the first time we had the NFSQ 27 Sage computers, the solid-state Sage computers. We'd love to give tours because you could pull cards out while it was running and no one would notice because it would correct errors from the missing card automatically. There are such things as error-correcting codes. Your DNA is a 3 out of 4 error-correcting code. And there's adaptive coding where the syntax actually modifies depending on the application. These are your DNA involves the most sophisticated codes man knows of. Now, the building blocks, of course, in life are amino acids. There's only 20 that are utilized by living systems in the construction of proteins. And by the way, they're all left-handed. If you have a tetrahedron, it can be left or right-handed. If you have codes, you can have a mirror image of them. The one kind are called left-handed. All the living tissues are made of left-handed codes. If you have right-handed codes, they're lethal. They're lethal to the left-handed codes. What does this mean? If amino acids were by randomness, you'd have half of each kind. Remember the old story about monkeys? If you had monkeys typing on a typewriter long enough, they'd do Shakespeare's sonnets or something, that nonsense? What if every other key in the typewriter was lethal to the monkey? How far would you get? You see, these things cannot be by accident. They're by very skillful design. Most proteins are a linear sequence of from 100 to 500 amino acids long. And the actual chemical equations are complicated, but they form certain patterns that will simplify it all. It turns out there are 20 amino acids here listed that constitute all of life that are known. Half of these are hydrophobic, they're non-soluble in water, and they form the center core. The other half are soluble in water, and of those, some of them are positively charged, some are negatively charged, and they give the resulting complex its physical dimension and its affinity or repulsion to other molecules. These are the amino acids. This is the alphabet from which all life is made. They're defined by one of 4 letters, chemical letters, which we won't bother going through for the DNA. We're just going to call them A, T, G, and C, very commonly done in the field. A combination of these 4 letters will define any amino acid. And when the DNA replicates, these are always in pairs. Wherever you have an A, it'll be matched with a T. Wherever a G, you'll have a C, and vice versa. So if you build a string of these amino acids, there is a matching complementary string that's implied by it. Well, why go through all this trouble? Because it's automatically replicating. If it splits, the matching pairs will match up with it, and when you're all through, you can end up with a intrinsically self-replicating, error-free copying mechanic so that these things will replicate without error. This is very, very sophisticated engineering. which of course all happened by chance. The DNA is your master blueprint. It has to, when you want to do something on the factory floor, you need a working copy. So the DNA is made into an RNA, visualize that as a photocopy, and that gets translated by special robots into the specific proteins that you want, which are the functional machines. Now, going from the master copy to the proteins, the belief in microbiology was that was called the Crick dogma, that you went from DNA to proteins, it was always downhill. But what happens when you discover that when you go to the Xerox machine with your one and only master copy and you make a copy, that the Xerox machine modified your master copy? Would that make you uncomfortable? That's exactly what they've discovered in microbiology. They call those retroviruses. The scary part about certain viruses is they can go uphill and modify the master record. Pretty spooky stuff. And that's what's behind AIDS and all of that. When you take the DNA, there's certain parts you want and certain parts you don't want. You make a copy of the RNA, and then what you do is you cut away the introns, the parts you don't want, put together the parts you do. This is the same coding structure you find in your Bible with the equidistant letter sequences that Yaakov Ramsel likes to talk about. The same schema, the same equidistant letter sequence form of cryptography is what your body does with your DNA. Interestingly enough, to get the messenger RNA that's used on the floor. Now, I won't go through all the coding here. We're just taking a quick glimpse to get a flavor of all this. But it turns out that with these 3 out of 4, this alphabet of 4 letters, you can define any of the 20 amino acids with some redundancy and with punctuation, start and stop codes. And another way of visualizing this is in the form of a wheel. The mitochondria, the power stations use a slightly different code. They have just 3 minor changes, but it's the same basic concept. When you take one of these messenger RNAs, you have a set of robots that take a look at that to make the proteins. They decode the code that they see, the 3-letter code, which defines a protein, and as it moves along, it then assembles a chain of proteins that are defined by that code. In other words, it's reading the working copy, following its instructions, and putting together a protein chain. That protein chain, when released, will form a 3-dimensional shape, depending on its charges, that become a working robot to do what it's supposed to do. And I won't get into the 3-dimensional structure here, but let's just take an example of one of these proteins. We'll call it's hemoglobin. It's 574 amino acids long. This is the list of the different amino acids that are involved, 36 glycine, 68, and they're not in this order, obviously. They're in a very specific order. Here's the interesting part about this. It has to be in an exact order, or it's not hemoglobin. This is called specificity, and there's a formula for determining, in coding theory, this linear arrangement. It turns out that if you have 574 proteins of 20 different types, the different alternative configurations you can make with that is 10 to the 650th power. That's a big number. If you have the right combination, you have hemoglobin. If you have the wrong combination, you have hemoglobinopathy, which is lethal. Your hemoglobin has to be pretty much, there's a couple of small exceptions, but pretty much be in the right, that coding has to be in the right order. That's called specificity. This mathematically absolutely destroys any possibility of it happening by accident. It has to be by very, very skillful design. And that's just one of them. There's only 10 to the 18th seconds in the history of the universe, if you accept the scientists. There's only 10 to the 66th atoms in our entire galaxy, to give you a feeling. There's only 10 to the 80th subatomic particles in our entire galaxy. And we start, in physics, anything with a probability of less than 10 to the 50th is considered absurd. And we're talking here, in hemoglobin alone, a specificity of 10 to the 650th power, which is way beyond the possibility of happening by chance. Let's take another interesting concept. Let's take a single-celled bacteria. If you see the microscope, you see it has a little tail that propels it through the fluid. This is a diagrammatic of it. We're going to just focus of the single-celled creature. We're going to just focus on the place where the little flagellum connects to the bacteria. When we examine that carefully, we discover it has 40 parts, every one of which is essential. It's the old idea of irreducible complexity. We've all seen a mousetrap, right? I usually bring one up. I forgot to bring one up this time. Mousetrap consists of a little platform, a hammer, a spring, a hook to hold it back, and a little catch to hold the hook. 5 parts. If you don't have those 5 parts, it doesn't work. If you have only 4 of the 5 parts, you don't catch 4/5 as many mice. You catch 0, you see. There's a concept called irreducible complexity. Here's an example of a motor with D-rings and so forth that requires 40 parts. Here's the, it's what we call irreducible complexity. And it's another demonstration of skillful design. See, the big question is, did the DNA come first or did proteins come first? You can't have proteins without the DNA without proteins. It takes proteins to construct DNA. It takes DNA to make proteins. It's not a question chicken and egg. Which came first, protein or DNA? Answer, both had to be designed simultaneously, very skillfully. Both had to be created at the same time to a consistent system architecture. Thoughts, that is language, are not physical. They're conceptual. And that's exactly what the scripture is. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone throughout all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. We all know the first 4 verses of Psalm 19. Did you ever notice how many times the issue of information science is here, how they declare its speech, its knowledge, its language, its words? The universe is nothing more than a thought in the mind of God. Now, the major insights here, only the origin of information can't be explained. The reason the Darwinists cannot explain life is they cannot explain the origin of information. Where did the information come from? Irreducible complexity refutes design by accident or chance. The choreography of the cell defies random theories. Digital codes demand pre-planning and coordination. No system dependent on subsystems can survive random failures. If you have a system is dependent on subsystems, the failure of any one of those causes the whole system to die. That means you have to have coordinated design. And all cells anyway, let's move on. These are some of the background. Now let's talk about the issues. We've been tampering with the engines of creation. We'll talk about stem cells and cloning, which is hot in our society right now. I'd like you to place yourself in the following picture. You have a 6-year-old that you discover has a rare bone marrow disease, anemia, bleeding disorders, severe immune system problems, and is likely to die of leukemia within a year. Can you picture that? Picture that. Your kid. The doctor tells you there's a 90% chance of curing your child through a cell transplant technique from an umbilical cord of a matched sibling. In other words, you've got to develop an embryo that's a sibling, and by taking a cell from the umbilical cord, they can create a cure for your child. What would you do? The answer is pretty obvious. You'd go for it, wouldn't you? This is an actual case. Molly Nash was born with Fanconi anemia, destined for leukemia. The only effective treatment is to get a batch of healthy cells from a perfectly matched sibling to replace the cell's faulty bone marrow cells. Since each parent carries both a normal and a faulty version of the Fanconi gene, each pregnancy has a 25% chance of an affected child. So what do? The embryos are created by a standard in vitro fertilization in a laboratory dish and tested for the presence of the disease gene. Only those testing normal would be transferred to the woman's uterus. Only 2 of the 15 tested normal. Only 1 of those was healthy enough for transfer to Lisa Nash's womb. And of course, this Colorado couple used genetic tests to create a test tube baby that would have the exact type of cells desperately needed to save their 6-year-old daughter. She now has a 90% chance of being free from the marrow disease, and genetic screening is clearly going to be part of our future, whether we like it or not. And of course, both she and her new baby brother are doing fine. They're enjoying a normal, healthy life, both of them. See, we're dealing here with differentiation. It's interesting. There's a problem here. When cytokinesis results in identical cells, a cell splits into 2 identical cells, right? Those 2 split into 4. Those 4 to 8, and on it goes. You would think it should continue forever, always doing identicals. No, what happens is, suddenly they start to differentiate. And they start becoming more and more differentiated, in fact, into 210 different types of tissues, which of course makes the familiar embryo. Now the question is, and we could go through all this, but the before it differentiate, we call that a stem cell. It can be anything. And with a code of 4, which define any of the 20 amino acids, they in turn will define any of 100,000 different kinds of protein or robot machines. And of course, what happens to the stem cell, gradually it starts differentiating into over 210 different types of cells, which in turn become the tissues, the organs, and so forth. You have 10 to the 13th in total in typical human being. Now what the game becomes then is nuclear transfer. Before it differentiates is to go ahead and clone it by inserting the nucleus from another parent, and you end up with a clone or a replica of the original donor. That's what they call cloning. The proper term is nuclear transfer. You all know about the clone in sheep's clothing. The thing that made it possible was a needle-making machine, which in fact could remove the nucleus of a cell and replace it, and that of course ultimately led to Dolly and her surrogate mother, the famous sheep in Scotland. Cloning now has become common. They've cloned monkeys and pigs of all kinds, and calves and cattle. It's a whole industry on cloning. Now, one of the questions is why and when do replicating cells no longer remain identical? They're still studying that. Genetic engineering involves the manipulation of stem cells to produce desired tissues, and they offer the prospect of curing all kinds of elusive diseases. But also embodied in this technology is the ability of nuclear transfer, where you clone and replicate entire, complete beings, as Dolly the sheep exemplifies. And this, of course, leads to all kinds of moral, legal, and incidentally, theological issues. One of the great questions is, can a human clone get saved? The theologians will argue about that for years. When does tampering with an embryo become murder? Is it acceptable to clone a baby to save a child's life? These are not simple questions. Anyone that has glib answers hasn't thought it through. When does human life begin? You know, the minister and the Catholic priest and the rabbi were arguing about this. The minister said life begins at birth, and the Catholic priest says, no, you're out of date. Life begins at conception. And they argued about that for a while, and the rabbi said, you guys are both a little mixed up. Life begins when the dog dies and the kids are off to college. That's what it is. How will clones affect our society? If we start having clones around, will they be second-class citizens? Interesting issues here. And of course, the ultimate one is, can a human clone become saved? I harbor the suspicion that they can't be. In fact, I think they're alluded to in prophecy. I'll come to that shortly. What are the prophetic implications of all this? By the way, something else that's just been developed the last few days I've heard about is that they found ways to take unfertilized human eggs and coax them into differentiation without the presence of a sperm. And they've discovered that with the right electrical and chemical stimuli, they can coax an unfertilized egg into mitosis and produce an embryo yielding stem cells. This was first discovered in sea urchins, but it's presently, it just had limited successes with certain kinds of mice, and the embryos don't live long, but they'll figure out why and probably resolve that. This could be an end run on some of the moral dilemmas that are being talked about. Of course, the lesbians are all thrilled about this possibility. Let's talk a little bit about the dark side. Is this really a panacea for mankind, or is it a Pandora's box that we've opened? You know, let's not react to this and be reactionary. The possibility of biotechnology to provide major war against disease is exciting, whether it's AIDS, mental illness, autoimmune diseases of all kinds, obesity, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, heart disease, cancer. These are worthy challenges. We should applaud them. Cancer, leading cause of death after heart disease, 24%. 40% of Americans have already or will have cancer. 20% will die from it. 30% is caused by smoking, 30% by poor diet and lack of exercise. And of course, there's all kinds of genetic remedies for diseases you and I can't even pronounce. This is very, very important stuff. But there are limits. Genesis 11:6, that nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. And that's going to describe the society in which we live. Spooky stuff coming up. There is an audio track that I think they can cue up and have you hear. Dr. Richard Seed was one of the prominent practitioners in this field of endeavor on National Public Radio, said the following. Are we queued up for that? Can we try that soundtrack? Okay, go ahead and play it.
God made man in his own image. God intended for man to become one with God. We are going to become one with God. We are going to have almost as much knowledge and almost as much power as God. Cloning and the reprogramming of DNA is the first serious step in becoming one with God. Very simple philosophy.
Gives you a flavor. That's gives you a taste, an example of some of the thinking that lies behind the pagan side of this technology. Pretty spooky stuff. Well, some of the growing concerns in the biotech area, of course, there's few safeguards against errors or abuse. When you start cross-species maneuvering, you're going to introduce to species diseases that have been previously unknown and complications. The potential for self-replicating mutations are all impossible to anticipate. And all of this is being done not in well-controlled laboratories, but in environments where there's very few regulatory or procedural disciplines. These are not government labs or large corporate facilities. These are startups by the thousands all over the world, in garages, with very little capital it takes to mess around in this area, with everybody in a race for patents, very few people concerned with the possible implications or the escape of false starts. And there are very few, so this whole area is just rife with the possibility of abuse or problems. Now, tampering with the human genome, are there biblical precedents to this? And Genesis 6 is one of them. In Genesis 6, we have this strange stuff where the sons of God, the Benai Ha-Elohim, the fallen angels, messed around with human women to produce a hybrid species called Nephilim. And you need to understand Genesis 6. But what most people who have studied that may not appreciate, it wasn't limited to just before the flood. You will not understand the Old Testament unless you understand that even after the flood, there were the Rephaim. We'll talk a little bit about that. Why do we get interested in that? First of all, Jesus said, as the days of Noah were, so shall the days of the coming of the Son of Man be. And we're going to talk a little bit about what did Daniel mean when he talked about the miry clay in Daniel 2. And we'll talk about the coming one that Revelation talks about. In Genesis 6, the first two verses, I want you to notice something. The first two verses are a single sentence. Many scholars miss the significance of that. Translated says, it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God, the Benai Ha-Elohim, saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and took them wives of all whom they chose. One sentence. Sons of God. Benai Ha-Elohim is the term. In the Old Testament, it's exclusively used of angels. In the New Testament, there's equivalent terms in Luke 20 and 36. In the book of Enoch, which isn't inspired, I wouldn't call it inspired literature, but from the 2nd century before Christ to the 2nd century after Christ, it is an important scholastic document which describes the language, the grammar, and the linguistics that corroborate this interpretation of the Torah. The Septuagint, the translation of the Torah into Greek 3 centuries before Christ was born, uses the precision of the Greek to make it very clear we're talking about angels here, fallen angels. In verse 4 of that passage, it says there were Nephilim in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became the mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. The word Nephilim, it means the fallen ones. It comes from the Hebrew verb nafal, to fall, to be cast down, to fall away or desert. It's sometimes translated giants, because in the Septuagint, was translated by gigantes, which many people transliterate into giants. That's not what the word means. It means the earthborn. There's also a Hebrew term throughout the Old Testament you find. It's a strange term. It's called the Rephaim. It's sometimes translated giants. It's sometimes translated the dead. These are strange tribes. You might appropriately call them the living dead. And this is a whole study in its own right, but I encourage you to dig into it because you'll discover that these strange tribes were not eligible for resurrection. These are the tribes that Joshua was told to wipe out every man, woman, and child. That's pretty weird stuff as you read the Old Testament from a New Testament perspective. It sounds very serious. Why? What's going on here? Well, let's re-examine Noah a little bit. In verse 9 of Genesis 6, speaking of Noah, it says, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. The word perfect there is tamim. This is one of those verses, if you're a normal, well-adjusted human being, you read that verse and go on. But if you've been to one of my Bible studies, you are no longer a normal, well-adjusted human being. You ask yourself, why did the Holy Spirit say that? Why, the word perfect is always used of physical blemishes. Without blemish, they're unimpaired. Noah, one of his distinctives was that he had an unimpaired genealogy. He wasn't contaminated with the goings-on of that time, apparently. And of course, all of this takes significance to each of us because Jesus also predicted that in the end times, as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, he may have just meant, some scholars would say, he just meant it was going to be business as usual until Noah went in the ark, and that's justifiable. And yet, many scholars feel there's far more implied here. To understand this passage, you need to understand the days of Noah. You need to understand what this is all about. Now, I'm presenting to you the so-called angel view of Genesis 6, which is the view of the ancient rabbis. It's the view of the early church up until the 5th century, and yet it's not taught in most seminaries today. Some of our materials are controversial across the United States, not because of the UFO stuff, but because of our treatment of Genesis 6, which is the classic view. The commonly taught view is sometimes called the line of Seth view, which emerged in the 5th century, has no scriptural support. The fallen angel view was the view of the ancient Hebrew scholars. It was the view of the early church. It prevails today among the conservative scholarship, and it's confirmed in the New Testament by 2 or 3 witnesses. And Jude 6 and 7 and 2 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5, and some other passages clearly confirm the angel view of Genesis 6. I won't spend too much time on that. It's interesting that those same views are embodied in all the ancient legends of all the ancient cultures of the planet Earth. Not just the famous Greek Titans, but even the Sioux Indians, South Sea Island. You find this idea of fallen angels or their equivalent intermingling with the human race, producing a hybrid offspring. When you speak of Hercules or Atlas from the Greek mythology, you're dealing with what the Hebrews would call Nephilim. Don't confuse them from the fallen angels. They're the hybrid offspring with the fallen angels and human intervention. This is, as I say, traditional rabbinical literature. It's embodied in the book of Enoch, which is 2nd century literature. Testimony of the 12 Patriarchs. Josephus deals with this. The Septuagint, in its precision, deals with it. The early fathers, Philo, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and you can go right through the whole list. Modern scholarship between Pember, DeHaan, McIntosh, Dillage, Gaebelin, Pink, Barnhouse, Morris, Unger, Fruchtenbaum, Hal Lindsey, Chuck Smith, and others. The Sethite view is contradicted by the text itself. It implies inferred separation that didn't occur for until 6 chapters later. The inferred godliness of the Sethites is a myth that you can rebut from the scripture. The inferred Canaanite subset of the Adamites is contrivance. But the main thing is the unnatural offspring. The offspring were unnatural. When a believer and unbeliever have children, they be monsters, but they're not monstrous, you see. But the main thing is the New Testament confirms it. What startled me when I got into this, I always thought, well, that's interesting. It's just a part of the misty chapters of Genesis. I didn't realize you will not understand the prophecies and the history of the Old Testament unless you understand the angel view. I was shocked to discover that. The post-flood and prophetic issues. This was all part of Satan's stratagem to corrupt the human race, to corrupt Adam's line, to prevent a Messiah. And you can go through the whole history of the Scripture, from Abraham, the famines, the destruction of the male line in Exodus 1, Pharaoh's pursuit of Israel even after he let them go, the populating of Canaan. When God told Abraham, in 400 years, your descendants coming back, that gave Satan 4 centuries to lay down a minefield. These strange tribes, the so-called giants of Canaan. When God says he's going to do it all through David, David gets singled out. As God reveals his plan, it allows Satan to focus his attack. You can study the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation as Satan's attempt to thwart God's plan. But the post-flood Nephilim, also after that, they're encountered in Canaan when the spies go into the land. They saw they were giants in the land. The term there is Nephilim, these fallen ones, these strange creatures. We encounter the Rephaim. The Moabites called them the Emim. The Ammonites called them the Zamzummim. These are tribes that were of these race of giants, or race of Nephilim. The term is also often translated dead, and from that we get some interesting theological insights. Of course, we have the Anakim, Anak and his 7 sons, Og, the king of Bashan, king of the giants, Goliath and his brothers. We find in the Golan Heights, we went up with a 4x4, there are monuments up there that have never been excavated. The Gilgal Rephaim, it's a monument, sort of a Stonehenge type of structure. 5 circles, including 20-ton stones, dated about 3000 BC, built on a flat plateau, only visible from above. You can only understand this from an airplane, by the way. I don't know how Anyway, it's about 10 miles. Anyway, these things, there's several of them around. Destroying the Anakim, of course, is one of the key features of Joshua 11. When they finally killed the Anakim, there was none of the Anakim left, according in verse 22, in the land of the children of Israel, only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. How interesting it is that the places that Joshua failed to root them out are the places that the PLO has its headquarters today. I think that's kind of interesting. The kingdom of Og, king of Bashan. He was the last that remained of the remnant of the giants, or the Rephaim, the living dead, as I might call them. These did Moses smite and cast them out, Joshua 13:12. Og, the king of Bashan. This guy was a giant. His bed apparently was 9 cubits long. That's somewhere between maybe, 13 to 15 feet, depending on what cubit you use. This guy's a big guy. But it's interesting, when Jesus hung on the cross, there's a strange phrase in Psalm 22. He says, the bulls of Bashan encircled the cross. What on earth is Jesus talking about? Is there some demonic encounter there? I'll let you check it out. I'm intrigued that the Rephaim shall not live, Isaiah tells us. They are deceased. They shall not rise. Therefore thou hast visited and destroyed them and made all their memory to perish. Isaiah 26:14 it suggests to me that the Rephaim are not eligible for resurrection. Why? Because Jesus did not become a Nephilim and die for them. When you get to Daniel 2, we're all familiar with Daniel's famous vision, Nebuchadnezzar's dream that Daniel interprets for him. This image, a head of gold, arms and chest of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and then the feet are iron mixed with clay. And most of us that have studied this understand that it's Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome in 2 phases. No problem. I think most of us study it. The dream goes on, though, and speaks about how and by the way, I think most scholars recognize the iron and iron mixed with clay are 2 phases of the same empire. That's why we look for a revived Roman Empire. But in the dream, of course, a stone cut without hand strikes the image at the base and becomes a mountain that fills the whole earth. And so I think most of us in Daniel 2, the good news, it's all been interpreted for us. When you get to Daniel 7, Daniel later in his life has a series of visions. The alphabet of idioms is quite different, but the subject is the same. And I won't go into that here, except I'd like us to explore a little bit the strange business of the iron mixed with clay. What is the miry clay? It embarrasses me. For 30 years I've taught Daniel 2, the classical model that most of the teachers here would teach. And everybody wonders, what is the miry clay? It's in Aramaic, not Hebrew. The word mire is suggestive of death. Miry clay is made from mire or dust. Therefore it's brittle. But all those years I never paid attention to verse 43, which if you read Daniel 2, verse 43, there's a very interesting verse where Daniel explains what the miry clay is. He says, whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, he switches to a personal pronoun, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. Really? When you come here from Genesis 6, you suddenly have a whole different insight. You see, I've had this checked out. The grammar requires that the they have to be something other than the seed of men to mingle. Or it doesn't make grammatical sense. They, whoever they are they Nephilim? Are they clones? I have no idea. But there's something, they are not the seed of men. And they're apparently numerous enough to be a constituency, a political constituency at that time. I increasingly suspect that this is an allusion to genetic engineering of some kind, either demonic or human, one or the other. Well, we've got a lot of growing concerns. Closed-loop systems usually operate counterintuitively. Our allergies are the immune system overreactions. We have all kinds of regulatory anomalies we call cancer. We also have intelligent intruders. They've discovered something interesting about bacteria, by the way. The E. coli, Salmonella, and 30 other bacteria they discover can do quorum sensing. These are single-celled creatures, okay? Your bacteria. What they do, it turns out, they take roll. When there's a bacteria in your body, they check out and see if there's more guys like them around. And they won't attack until they feel they've got enough to win. The scientists call that quorum sensing. It reminds you of Luke 14. What king going to make war against another king sitteth not down first and consulteth whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000? Or else while the others yet a great way off, he sendeth an ambassage and desireth conditions of peace. In other words, they're discovering that bacteria communicate. How do they communicate? They don't know. They figure if they can find out how they communicate, they can interdict that communication and render them useless. Let's hope they can do that. And then, of course, there's cross-species diseases. That's terrifying. The possibility we're going to introduce into our culture diseases that have never been heard of before. I think some of the weird stuff in Revelation may be genetic engineering gone awry. Retroviruses can skip generations. You may have diseases unheard of that you got from your great-grandfather. And there's also the concept of directable intruders. This is spooky stuff. If you saw the movie Mission Impossible 2, it deals with the whole idea of genetic warfare and creating directable intruders and a cure for them and so forth as a form of weapons. Now, there are 3 technologies you want to be aware of. One is nanotechnologies. They're now scientists are increasingly able to make molecule-sized robots themselves in the computer field. They call that nanotechnology. There's also the field of robotics, and the goal of robotics is to make self-modifying sentient machines, machines that can think in some form and modify themselves. That's the ultimate goal of robotics. Then you have genetics, which has its goal the self-replication of manipulated entities. What's disturbing is the goal of these 3 technologies converging into one. What would be their collective goal? The creation of self-replicating sentient machines capable of directable diseases targeting specific groups or individuals. It's viewed by the experts that the day will come when we'll be able to create a disease that will single out a particular genetic group, ethnically or even individually. Spooky stuff. There are people in the past that if they had access to that kind of technology, it curls your blood to think what their possibilities might have been if they had that technology. Is that the kind of technology that's going to be available to leaders in the future? Very disturbing possibilities. The ultimate absurdity that I've come across that I have to share with you is the idea there are people that are serious about trying to clone Jesus Christ. You may laugh, but the idea is take a DNA sample from some religious relic, do a nuclear transfer to a stem cell, and have a virgin surrogate mother. There's about 40 of these women that have volunteered. The target date for this is December 25th, the year 2001. But as you consider this, it's of course the experts are saying it's ridiculous because to get Dolly required 276 failures. And those failures put the mother in jeopardy, not just the embryo. There's another dimension to this. If they go to the Shroud of Turin, there are some experts that believe that the shroud is not Jesus Christ's blood, but it's the blood of Jacques de Molay, who was the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, who was executed in a parody of the crucifixion in 1314. So even if they succeed, they may not get the guy they expecting to get. And of course, there are fictional novels already starting to surface in the marketplace of the Clone Jesus trilogy and so forth. It is interesting, in Revelation 17:11 it says, speaking of the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, but he is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. I don't know what that verse means. I've taught Revelation for many years. I know there's many conjectures, and we share some of those. But what does that really mean? I don't think any of us are sure. He is an 8th, but he is of the 7. Is he a clone? I don't know. We'll see. Won't be long. I think the restrainer in 2 Thessalonians 2 is restraining far more than you and I have any capacity to imagine. And after his removal, I believe the world is going to be more bizarre than we have any capacity to imagine. If somebody asked me to do a special effects movie of what's the world like after the rapture, I wouldn't even try. Because I think the way it's going to be is too bizarre for us to try to fly in today's culture. I think the restrainer is restraining, you see, he's restraining sin. If he's just restraining sin, he's doing a poor job. He's restraining something called the mystery of iniquity, whatever that is. But I think when he stops restraining, it's going to get really weird. In fact, Jesus tells us, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. And don't assume that the elect is the church. There are at least 3 different categories of saved people. There's the Old Testament saints, there's the church, and there's the post-rapture saints. So don't let those terms confuse you. Do your homework. Well, let's just summarize where we are and wrap this up. Origin of information cannot be explained. That's the problem of the Darwinists. They can't explain the origin of information. Irreducible complexity refutes design by accident or chance. The choreography of the cell defies any random theories of engineering. Digital codes demand pre-planning. And no system dependent on subsystems can survive random failures. All this is a total refutation of the very premises that our society is built upon, the whole idea of evolution. So I'm going to let's see. I think I can sneak in one more insight and we'll go on. We talked about cells and so forth. We now know that subatomic particles have no locality. See, Nachmanides in the 12th century said that the universe has 10 dimensions. He did that from studying Genesis 1. He said only 4 of these are knowable. I love this because the particle physicists today have discovered that we live in at least 10 dimensions. Only 4 are directly measurable. 6 are curled less than 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. The more you get into quantum physics, the more strange it becomes. David Bohm was a protege of Einstein. He is one of the world's most respected quantum physicists. He did landmark work in plasma physics. He believed that at the subatomic level, location ceases to exist. And John Bell in 1964 formulated a mathematical approach to try to test this, but they didn't have the technology to try it. But in 1982, Alan Aspect and a group of his associates at CERN conducted a landmark experiment. They demonstrated that subatomic particles have no locality. And they took 2 photons in lasers traveling in opposite directions in 6.5 meters. They had switches that were fast enough to switch before they got there, and they discovered that the photons knew what the other photons were doing simultaneously. All photons in the universe apparently know what all the other photons are doing. They have no locality. Strange stuff. See, part of our problem is we try to force fit our discoveries into obsolete models, and that's what Romans 1, verse 20 warns us against. And the whole issue in life is not chemistry, it's information. Jurassic Park demonstrates that. Remember the movie Jurassic Park? They recreated prehistoric dinosaurs by simply a piece of information, by the DNA embodied in the and so forth. That whole thing is a very interesting lesson in resurrection. Although it's fiction, it's close, it's provocative. And of course, all of us do have a genetic defect. It's not HIV positive, it's SIN positive. Why? Because through that we become disconnected from the source through rebellion. And that just like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, requires the intervention of the designer to give us a chance to get reconnected. So man is invading a world which he has only the faintest glimpses. The uncharted impacts can replicate seen, unseen, transcend borders, species, and generations. And only the most committed can persist in denying the role of a deliberate creator. And that's our scientific community. They are very committed to denying a creator. You and I, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Psalmist says, "For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works that my soul knoweth right well. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being incomplete, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them." We were all, when did God first start dealing with you? Before the foundation of the world. Read Psalm 139, it's rich stuff. Well, how do you go from here? I realize I'm late. I'm going to encourage you to learn the Bible in 24 hours if you haven't done so, and from there go to a verse-by-verse study. I encourage you to do that in a home where you're leading it, and we supplement that, if you like, with topical briefings, not just on biotech, but on any of the prophetic or scientific subjects that interest you. But all of this are resources that you have in your home that are probably more rich than most seminaries have at their fingertips. Get not only just our monthly news journal, there are many good newsletters. Subscribe to them. They're rich. They'll feed you with stuff you can't get anywhere else. Check our internet site. Incredible resources there. And sign up for e-news, the weekly bulletin. It's free. But the main thing I encourage you to do is do study on your own, and if possible, lead a group in your home. And with that, God bless you.